Tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Ann Milne tōku ingoa no Kotirana me Ingarangi o Kutupuna I tuku ake a hau I te tai tokerai ki Pātaua me Whangārei, ko roa hau me tōku whānau e noho ana ki roto o Tāmaki. Engari, e nai nei kei te noho a hau I te Waipounamu ki motu pōhue. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in this talk this afternoon, and my thanks to the Leadership Lab and Leaders Connect team, especially to Judy for your facilitation and Carolyn, and for Stephen for the technical backup I really needed. So I'm speaking today from my home in Bluff at the foot of Motu Pōhue, where the peak hour traffic outside my window right now is the steady stream of fishing boats returning with their catches. I'm a Pākehā, white, educator, researcher, writer, former school principal, a mother, grandmother and great-grandmother of Māori children and mokopuna, and it's no secret that as a whānau of educators, my whānau has been outspoken about not being prepared to settle for the product our schools serve up to our Māori learners. And I don't see that as me taking any sort of position on Māori education, because that's definitely not my role, or the role of any of us who are not Māori, to be speaking about what Māori need to do. Because the problem isn't with our Māori learners, it's us. And to be crystal clear by us and we in this talk, I mean those of us who really have to question that monocultural system, that leadership, that training, those assessment practices, that pedagogy and curriculum content that we think of as normal in what I call our white stream schools. And most of that, us, are Pākehā. And I've challenged teachers many times in the past by asking, what would we do if we woke up tomorrow morning and schooling as we know it was wiped out? Would we recreate what it looks like now? What would we keep and what would we throw out? Well, we had our chance last year and we've had further chances since. And some schools have made major changes and most haven't. And most couldn't wait to get back to that normal. And I do understand the stress and the overload and the anxiety, and I get that all over the country, principals and teachers have run themselves ragged trying to do the very best that they can. And I know that some schools have made long-lasting changes, but I wish we hadn't largely missed that opportunity to understand that normal is actually the problem. COVID impact articles and reports are littered with language about disruption to learning progress and whether or not students will be able to catch up, or completely ignoring the fact that for Māori and Pasifika students who never could see themselves in our learning programs, it doesn't matter much whether learning's coming directly from the teacher standing in front of you or via a laptop or mum's phone. It's distance learning all the time. And there's absolutely no point in us talking about our children's mental health and well-being if we don't understand this. So let me use that whānau background I described to give you an example of what I mean. Take a brief look first at the famous experiment originally conducted in the 1940s that asked young children questions about brown and white dolls. The doll experiments have been repeated many times since, and all with similar conclusions. So I want to call this point A, our starting point for change. And my apologies for the video quality, but the message is a really powerful one.
Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with?
This one. I like that one.
Show me.
Okay.
This one.
That one?
This one. I like to play with this.
And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll?
He's white.
And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And can you give And why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you? "15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll."
So that's in America, right? Well, about 12 years ago, a group of senior students at Hurihanganui College in South Auckland decided they'd carry out a similar brown-white doll experiment with 5-year-old Māori children in a kura kaupapa Māori. Our students expected the children would identify strongly as Māori, and they were astounded when their results showed the same attitudes towards the dolls. I could have warned them. Shopping for identical brown and white dolls, or any brown dolls actually, for the students' research had proven to be impossible. So I ordered them from America. And when they arrived, I gave them to 2 of my granddaughters to play with before I took them to school. They'd just graduated from ko hanga reo, and te reo Māori was their first language. They took one look at the dolls and threw the brown doll in the corner, pronouncing it was ugly. And they happily played and fought over the white doll. So it seems that hasn't changed very much. So fast forward a generation to my great-grandchildren, 2 of them in this next video clip, 9 and 11 years old, who epitomise that kahikitia vision that Māori children are enjoying and achieving education success as Māori, with the words we've tagged on in the last kahikitia refresh, as they develop the skills and participate in te ao Māori, Aotearoa and the wider world. So let's call this point B, or your horizon, if you like.
No way, e te whānau, the winner is 10 YouTube!
Kua tuhia te tokorua nei ki ngā puka puka hitori. This is history in the making.
Thank you, Aotearoa koutou.
Me 2 of the youngest artists to walk away with not just one,
Got that YouTube!
but 2 Aotearoa Music Awards.
To be honest, we were like this. Our little minds blown.
All in the name of love, their love for te reo Māori.
Our childhood was so beautiful and so tāhua that we wanted people to experience the beautiful reo that we had.
Taking home the Manareo Award for their single Peke. And beating some huge music industry names to win the People's Choice.
All we wanted to do was entertain people, but now what we actually want to do is show our reo. Yeah.
With the help of their whānau, who just so happened to run a production company, Te YouTube now has 4 successful seasons under their belt, 3 chart-topping waiata, over 3 million views on YouTube, and more than 14,000 subscribers.
The best part for me was going to Disneyland because we were going to some other place, but we were still speaking our language, reo Māori. We didn't even care. We didn't even care if people judged us. Yeah. What matters if what you love about your language and you have to speak it.
It's been really, really awesome to see that, but also to use that as a tool showing whānau, not just tamariki, but whānau Māori that he mana tō te reo Māori.
We want other people to raise their child in te reo Māori.
So when people come to us and say, I love that language you speak, maybe they should teach their children how to speak that, and maybe they could speak like that.
So, as well as the nanny bragging rights, of course, as Māori and not a percentage or a reading, writing or maths outcome in sight. In his support of the girls' acceptance speeches, my grandson Shay, who you saw in the video, said, to all our Māori whānau out there on your journey of te reo Māori, this is the embodiment of 3 generations of hard work to reclaim our language. And it shouldn't escape our notice that talking about speaking te reo Māori at Disneyland, the girls commented they didn't care if people judged them. That's something, unfortunately, both have had some experience of here. So how did we get from, as a whānau, sorry, hang on, from point A to point B? One word, intentionally. As Shay said, through deliberate hard work with a clear goal. And how do we as school leaders get our learners, particularly our Māori learners in our schools, from a similar point A to point B? Same word, intentionally. But our problem is with our goal, because decades of defining that as meeting or exceeding numeracy and literacy, so-called norms, should show us it doesn't work for all of our children. Let's look more closely at point A. Although we don't want to admit it, point A is our normal. How does that thinking we saw in those young children with the dolls become entrenched so early? Research points to societal attitudes and to the way children's self-image is affected in the ways they see themselves, especially in texts, both verbal and visual. Schools are complicit in perpetuating those attitudes. In fact, we're largely responsible for them. Dale Takitumu talks about the architecture of colonisation and the removal of rich Māori knowledge, Māori storytellers, artists, composers, the keepers of Māori narratives, as a deliberate strategy of colonisation. A swap out, she calls it, replaced with the likes of Humpty Dumpty, Jack and Jill, and Goldilocks, which she describes as the ultimate case of white privilege, where Goldilocks just rocks on into someone's house and starts helping herself. Think about the parallels to that attitude in our education system. I've used many ways to describe point A as the place in our schools where our thinking and where white spaces are entrenched. In my colouring book analogy for our schools, where that white background is just there and the lines show the boundaries where the colour's allowed to go. This continuum, where at best, most schools identify themselves as somewhere in the 4 boxes on the left. Well, to be honest, no one says they're in the white box, although that's not always true. But they usually think they're around where culturally responsive sits. And this set of diagrams from an educator's guide to changing the world, with this one that describes the status quo, but definitely point A, definitely the norm, where that white core is the central place of power, occupied in our case by Pākehā, and outside that core are all those we minoritise. That's supremacy and privilege and racism and all the words that we don't like to hear and avoid saying out loud. The diagrams of social transformation explain perfectly the solid resistance of our white spaces to the changes we need to make. And they also show us some of the changes that we genuinely, with the very best of intentions, think will move us on from point A, but that actually don't make all that much difference. Like the safety net model, that doesn't challenge the dynamics of the white core, but tries to make those we've minoritised feel better so they can better tolerate that colonised space. It's a missionary saviour approach that makes us feel we're doing good works. It's like the blue box on my continuum, and I upset people when I say it's often very much like the early communities of learning. At their best, most of our attempts at school reform fit this liberal empowerment model. The focus is on fixing the kids, ignoring the fact that we damaged them in the first place. The liberal empowerment model is about improving the education of Māori and the other groups we minoritise by facilitating their movement into the core. If they learn and play by our rules, it's about teaching them to play our game, not about changing the rules altogether. And the fact remains that 90% of Māori children are exposed to this damaging type of education inside that white core space, which it's glaringly obvious fails to meet their education needs and pretends not to understand how hegemony works to perpetuate the dominance of the core until eventually we all think it's normal and we no longer question it. And any sort of inclusion of our Māori children into that white space can't be anything other than assimilation. So is that really still our goal? I want to make a distinction between being a white person and whiteness, which is a system, a way of thinking, and a way of viewing the world. Now, I can't change the fact I'm white. I don't want to change that. It's my whakapapa, it's who I am. But if I continue to drive and replicate a white worldview without any understanding of how that dominates, how that damages, then I'm using my privilege and supremacy over others. And that's completely unacceptable. And it's racist. It's not unconscious and it's not casual. We know we're aware of this and how it works to our benefit. That's why it stays the same. The very first step in our journey from starting point A to where we want to get to at point B is to start to unpack whiteness for ourselves. So I want to jump ahead to point B and then come back to the space in between because, as I said, I think our problem is our goal. And there's not much point mapping out our trajectory if we haven't worked out what it is we're aiming for. Point B is your goal. It might not be exactly the same as my point B, but it certainly needs a circuit breaker, a complete new start, not a tweak or an add-on to what we already have. And let me again be very clear. Am I saying that national expectations for literacy and numeracy or NCEA are not important goals? Of course not. I am, however, saying they are nowhere near enough for our Māori and other marginalised children. Because our Pākehā children, reducing in numbers each year and now down to just 46% of our national roll, so no longer a majority, are able to learn and flourish in a school environment that largely reflects their values and belief. Take our definitions of success and achievement, our hierarchies, our models of leadership, our school structures and organisation, our teacher training, and how the schools that society thinks of as best come from high decile, predominantly white communities. At point B, we've defined what else we think is important, because the resounding message we send our Māori and Pasifika children now is that it's definitely not you. Think back to that continuum and the boxes that were on the right. Here they are again, expanded with some of the left-hand ones removed. So let's agree we've moved on from the deficits in the white box, although the messages our Māori children receive, both covertly and overtly, don't always seem that's the case. Our seriously disproportionate stand-down, suspension and exclusion statistics are just one example that leads them to believe that our failure is their fault. The culturally responsive box in the middle is probably where most of us pat ourselves on the back about reaching without realising that it matches that liberal empowerment diagram. Culturally responsive and culturally relevant models, now over 20 years old, are asset or strength-based models that expect Māori and marginalised children to use their cultural strengths to facilitate their movement into that white core. So that's not point B. Point B is in the final box. Point B aims to disrupt and undo colonisation. It decenters whiteness. It's critically conscious. It perpetuates and sustains students' cultural knowledge and identity, not just responds to them. The Point B curriculum critiques and names the conditions that impact on children of colour and positions actions to counter them as necessary, positive, urgent, and normal. Paris and Arlene point out that the question that drives our current point A norms-obsessed model is how can we get these working class kids of colour to speak, write, be more like middle-class white ones. Point B leaders change the gaze and put their energies into answering the question, what would our pedagogies look like if this gaze wasn't the dominant one? Point B is the final in those social transformation diagrams, where we proceed intentionally, there's that word again, to break the stranglehold of that white core, to change from practices that are still colonial and racist to practices that genuinely recognise all knowledge as valid and equal, and power is genuinely negotiated, navigated and shared. And Māori must be able to determine the shape and growth of your point B for your Māori learners. So that's a major leap, right? How on earth are we supposed to get to there? So this is where I get all the what about questions. You know, what about Ero? What about the white kids? What about the parents and the community? What about my analysis of variance? And what about the ministry? Well, you know, never has the support for this change been stronger. Never in my wildest dreams or in all my years of battling with them did I expect the words critically conscious and anti-racist to come out of the Ministry of Education, but here they are, along with embedding Te Tiriti o Waitangi, learning Te Reo Māori, underpinning our national PLD priorities. They're in Kahikitia, they're mandated in the national education and learning priorities. They're in our standards for the teaching profession and in requirements for school boards. Critical consciousness is explained by the ministry as reflecting critically on the imbalance of power and resources in society and taking anti-oppressive action to do something about it for the better. I don't like the something thing, but that's a start. That means specifically naming colonisation, racism, assimilation, oppression, whiteness, that's privilege, supremacy, fragility, hegemony, cultural reproduction, and intergenerational trauma, just to list a few, and actively working against them all. For me, critical consciousness is always the missing piece in our efforts to develop change, because often it requires soul searching that we're just not ready for. We all know we have to make change, but mostly we've got no idea of the size of the change that we have to make. So what is in the pathway between our current norms and white spaces at point A and our point B goals, and what is not? So I want to firstly look at what's not. It's not tiptoeing cautiously through the stages in this continuum, becoming less racist, more culturally responsive, waiting for all the staff in a school to embrace change. Like, how many more generations do we want our Māori children to wait while we take our time as if there was no urgency and we were doing no damage? I use an activity that identifies 94 white spaces, I call them sharks, that we could eliminate from our thinking and practice almost immediately if we wanted to. That's in my online course 1. It's not your kapahaka or the occasional pōwhiri or Māori words peppered through your values and your environments and websites. It's not Māori Language Week or starting your newsletters with kia ora. It's not your carvings or your murals or the core whaiwhai patterns around your wall displays. Each one of those would be great if they were not add-ons to the white spaces, but were an integral part of a much bigger strategy for authentic change. And it's also, shock, horror, not equity. Certainly not what we currently think that is, defined usually by our percentages and numeracy, literacy, NCEA outcomes. So I'm sure you've all seen this image showing the difference between equity and equality. And I've certainly used it myself with some cutting and pasting amendments. So you might be surprised by this headline. The Equity in Education Coalition call it white supremacy because it feeds into that so familiar racist thinking that this child and other children like him or her take up too many resources, they're too needy, their parents need to take responsibility for their height, they could provide their own boxes if they really wanted to, and so on. You've all heard what I'm talking about. So last year, I asked 2 of my clever mokopuna to draw me this version where the children are all the same size. Now the short child's not the problem. The problem is the uneven and unequal ground Māori learners are forced to stand on in the first place. And it doesn't matter how you try to pretty up that picture, the ground is always uneven. And if you think back to those social transformation diagrams, that uneven ground is the same as that white core, and it's heavily invested in staying the same. The success of your Māori learners depends on the critically conscious attention you pay to levelling that ground. It has nothing to do with fixing their reading, writing, or NCEA outcomes. They are the symptoms of your ground, and they are not the fault of your learners. At point B, you've intentionally levelled the ground. Dr. Paparangi Reid says, inequity is a symptom of oppression. Equity is not the end game. The end game is sovereignty. That means that instead of a very white education system determining what the norms are, what normal looks like, and whose knowledge counts, it's a position where Māori determine their end game, can decide whether or not they want to play, whether they might want to change the rules or start a completely new game. That's at point B. So what is in the space between point A and point B? This is the size of the change. Your point B goal has to be embedded in every aspect of your school's practice. It has to be backward mapped from that end result that you and your community, your different communities work out together. And they might be different outcomes for different groups. Again, what are those goals? Like the graduate profiles in the center of this diagram, not just Western academic knowledge, but what other knowledges and outcomes? And the questions for you as leaders are, how courageous are you prepared to be to step outside your comfort zone and journey from white spaces to critically conscious, culturally sustaining spaces? How much action are you prepared to take? And how much change do you really want to make?